If the Greeks want to become an empire, they'll need to capture Troy. But how?
If you turn from that strategic setting to the operational level, they had no choice.
Again, Brigadier General John Brown and his staff apply modern military planning to the ancient battles of the Trojan War.
From a personnel point of view, what would you tell me about the layout if this represents the Mycenaean capability and this area right here, Troy?
Troy's population did not compare in military manpower to the Greek state allied against it.
The Greeks assemble a coalition army to outnumber the Trojans 5 to 1. They'll need that overwhelming force to ensure a quick, decisive victory. And to deliver that force, Homer says the Greeks sailed to Troy on 1,000 black-bowed ships.
Is there anything we should know from an intelligence point of view?
Well, a couple things I'd like to point out, sir. First, as you know, Troy is a heavily fortified city. It's got a strong and a high wall. If we allow them to get behind that wall, that means we're going to have to lay siege to them. Also, they have a series of potential allies that if we alienate them, could come down on the side of the Trojan.
Well, given that intelligence backdrop, what do you think the operation should look like?
The Greeks should land directly before Troy and either defeat them on the battlefield in open combat with our overwhelming force or starve them out of their walled city.
Overwhelming force delivered directly to the shores of Troy on 1,000 ships. The Greeks are poised to recapture Helen, restore their honor, and gain power and wealth by controlling the most important trade route of the Bronze Age. It's a simple enough plan. One last logistical consideration: how to feed 1,000 ships full of warriors.
What's your thoughts there, logistician?
The Trojans would have gathered all the local food and water that was available and pulled it within the walls of their defenses for their own use and as a means of denying it to the use of the Greeks. The Greek army, therefore, would have to go further and further afield to gather those supplies of food and water that they were going to need to subsist on. And the primary risk there is that they would alienate those local populations that heretofore had not been engaged in the conflict but would now be inclined to come in on the side of the Trojans.
Well, it's an interesting point you make, John, because it looks like the Greeks were divided between what they should do in order to win most easily and what they had to do in order to survive as an army. They had no choice except to support themselves off the land by foraging and by raiding.
And it is precisely the result of one of those raids that starts Homer's Iliad. Agamemnon and Achilles fight over a woman that Achilles captures during a raid. Agamemnon pulls rank and claims Achilles' war prize for himself. Achilles rages, reaches for his sword. Professor of Classics Robert Garland reads from the Iliad.
Someday, I swear, a yearning for Achilles will strike Greece's sons and all your armies. But then, Agamemnon, harried as you will be, nothing you do can save you, not when your hordes of fighters drop and die, cut down by the hands of man-killing Hector. Then you will tear your heart out desperate, raging that you disgraced the best of the Greeks.
Achilles withdraws himself and his troops from battle, and the raids the Greeks conduct drive the neighboring population into an alliance with the Trojans. The Greeks lose their advantage of overwhelming force, and the war drags on for 10 long years with no clear victor.
I think from the point where Homer begins the Iliad, where there is a quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles, his most important warrior, it's clear that this is not altogether a coalition of the willing that he has brought to Troy.
The trouble for this coalition of the unwilling starts 10 years earlier back on mainland Greece, where Agamemnon plots a course of revenge and plunder. There, he will be forced to make the ultimate sacrifice, the ritual murder of his own daughter. Troy, a Bronze Age World Trade Center. Sung about by Homer, his Iliad and Odyssey become the first literary works of Western civilization. But is the mythological city real? archaeologists now seem certain they have discovered the legendary Lost City. But what evidence do we have of the enemies of Troy? The Bronze Age Greeks and Homer's King of Kings, Agamemnon. How does Agamemnon forge a coalition of Greek warlords to wage a war of revenge and plunder? This is the true story of Troy. West of Troy, across the Greek islands dotting the Aegean, lies mainland Greece. Athens, Sparta, Pylos, Olympus, and at their center, the largest and richest of the Bronze Age principalities, Mycenae. Hidden in these ruins is evidence of their wealth and power. Spiros Iakovides is the godfather of Mycenaean archaeology and director of excavations.
I have been working here since '58, which means for 40 odd years. And I have come to love the place. Mycenaean civilization was a time of very active interconnections. People had to come through Mycenae or through the area of Mycenae wherever they wanted to go.
Just the sight of this fortress sends a message of power to friend and foe alike. The city's walls rise 40 feet high and span 25 feet wide. Today, Christofilis Magidis, Assistant Director of Excavations, approaches the main entrance, a 20-ton stone carving called the Lion Gate, which dates to the time of the Trojan War.
The main element here is the lion relief on top of the gate in the relieving triangle. Here we have an amalgam of political statements and religious allusions.
The column represents the house of the king, and the lions, his power and protectors. It is a massive display of the king's divine right to rule.
It's a very strong statement for the incomer at the first moment he enters the citadel.
Just inside the Lion Gate, here in 1876, Heinrich Schliemann uncovers one of the richest finds in archaeological history, including a magnificent golden death mask. In his showman-like way, he proclaims, "I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon." High atop the citadel, archaeologists uncover remains of a palace much like one described by Homer. Inside, they discover a treasure trove of opulent relics and murals, glorifying Mycenaean war and conquest.
We have scenes, beautiful scenes, of a besieged city with tall buildings and women looking out of the windows, warriors, chariots, and horses. One cannot but think that these scenes reflect, or at least echo in some way, all the adventures of the Mycenaeans in southwest and northwest Asia Minor.
On the terrace of the palace, overlooking the rich valley and beyond to the Aegean, perhaps dreaming of conquering Troy, kings like Agamemnon would feast with fellow warlords. Homer describes such a feast that takes place across the Peloponnesian Peninsula in Pylos, in the kingdom of wise old King Nestor, another hero of the Trojan War. Here, in 1996, in the basement of a regional museum, archaeologist Sharon Stocker finds boxes of burnt animal bones. Stored there by the famous archaeologist Carl Blegen more than 50 years ago and labeled table scraps. Stocker finds something peculiar about them.
What we have represented here are bones from the thighs and the mandibles of bulls, male, cattle, and probably about 10 individuals are represented.
The meat from 10 cattle can feed 6,000 people. And the fact that the remains are specific body parts, and all from male bulls, makes Stocker and archaeologist Jack Davis suspect they have something more than table scraps.
It was here that he found the objects that we've been most interested in.
Yes.
That is, in this corner, more or less, must have been the gigantic heap of animal bones.
Clearly, the bones represent the animals eaten at the feast.
A little bit closer to the wall in here had to be the spearhead.
The spearhead is likely to be the butchering tool.
And then I think off here must have been the pile of little kilikas, the miniature drinking cups.
In Blegen's 1950s excavation, thousands of kilikis were discovered in every corner and corridor of Nestor's palace, representing thousands of guests drinking.
All of these objects were grouped in close proximity here, one to another.
But they also find one more piece of evidence. Written in a primitive script known as Linear B, translated in the 1950s, the tablet reveals another purpose for the feast.
So it's about here that the tablet was found that proves that sacrifices were in the process of being made in honor of the god Poseidon.
Piecing together the evidence, Stocker and Davis paint a clear picture of feasting in the Bronze Age.
Okay, so Sherry, if we were coming here to a feast, this must be where we get our first glimpse of the actual banqueting area.
Then the guests, as Homer says, ate well, and no man's hunger lacked a share of the banquet. The young men brimmed the mixing bowls with wine and poured rounds for all.
And they would have seen the power of the kings displayed there on the walls above them as they were participating in the feast, as a kind of reminder of what the Mycenaeans were capable of doing.
Yes.
By providing this feast and sacrifice, the king presents himself as the messenger to the gods, and his call to war as divine destiny. Surely the feast in this setting is a persuasive weapon for a king luring warriors to join him in a battle against the Trojans. But as a final appeasement to the gods, King Agamemnon must make the ultimate sacrifice: the ritual murder of his own daughter. Helen, Queen of Sparta, is abducted by Paris, Prince of Troy. A personal attack on family honor escalates to an international crisis. With enticements of wealth and power, King Agamemnon forges an unwilling coalition of Mycenaean Greek warlords to do battle with the Trojans. But now, the gods and his warriors demand from him the ultimate sacrifice: the ritual murder of his own daughter. This is the true story of Troy. At perhaps the most disturbing intersection of mythology and history lies the practice of human sacrifice. How can an act considered the ultimate sacrilege in the modern world be so prevalent to the ancients? Classics professor Robert Garland on a beach not unlike that of Troy.
Human sacrifice is committed by Agamemnon. Achilles, we are told, slaughters 12 Trojan youths to appease the spirit of his friend Patroclus. And at the end of the war, Polyxena is sacrificed at the grave of Achilles.
Although these incidents of human sacrifice exist in the mythological realm, there is also historical evidence of human sacrifice. From Egypt to Babylon, slave and prisoner sacrifice is widespread during the Bronze Age, often used as a public display of the king's power. But could the Greeks, founders of Western civilization, also have practiced human sacrifice?
There seems to be some archaeological record of human sacrifice. I'm just going to mention certain chamber tombs here in the area of Mycenae, where we have found bodies of slaves, one on top of the other. They were probably slaughtered when their master died, or prisoners of war, and so on and so forth. To them, it was not probably human sacrifice. What we consider human sacrifice is not the same thing with what they consider human sacrifice. A slave or a prisoner of war is an object, is not a human being.
Interestingly, although human sacrifice is prevalent in the mythology of Greece and the Trojan War, Homer never mentions it in the Iliad. It's a few hundred years after Homer when some of the greatest Greek playwrights incorporate human sacrifice into their stories of the Trojan War. One reason may have been as a storytelling device to entertain their audiences.
It's often true that forms of religious behavior that were once sacrosanct and received great veneration later on become the subject for horror and a way of getting a chill, really, out of the audience.
So in the story of the Trojan War, Agamemnon succeeds at assembling a coalition of Mycenaean warriors. But as they ready to set sail for Troy, the winds blow against them. The oracle tells Agamemnon, for favorable winds, he must sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia.
He did so by summoning her to Aulis on the pretext that she was going to be married to Achilles. Instead, he butchered her, and in so doing, set in train a terrible set of events that would end in his own death.
To the Greeks, this was a powerful message, whether real or mythological. In war, a king asks his subjects to sacrifice the lives of their sons. Now the king, by offering his daughter, is making a similar sacrifice. The Greeks may see it as democratic and egalitarian. If not us, why not the king? And if not our sons, why not his daughter?
To us, the idea of sacrificing Iphigenia seems horrific. But given the religion and mores of the time, the sacrifice of Iphigenia was a supreme expression of commitment on the part of Agamemnon. He was so committed to the success of this enterprise that he was willing to sacrifice his own daughter. That must have had an effect upon the psyche of his soldiers, because they recognized how dedicated he was and how much he expected of them.
Thus, the first blood spilled in the Trojan War is that of a child. Ultimately, Agamemnon will pay for her death with his life. But for now, a forceful wind blows the Greek war fleet east to Troy. What the Greeks didn't know is the resistance they were about to meet at the hands of man-killing Hector and his army of Trojans. To forge a coalition of Mycenaean warriors and satisfy the gods, Agamemnon makes the ultimate sacrifice, the ritual murder of his own daughter. In 1,000 ships, the Greeks sail east to Troy with dreams of wealth and honor. But their overwhelming force is negated by the fierce Trojans and their powerful allies. They fight to a standstill for 10 long years. Now, powerful egos and dissension in the Greek ranks threaten to destroy the coalition from within. This is the true story of Troy. It is an epic clash of civilizations, a defining moment in prehistory to which, once again, Homer may be our best witness.
In the 16,000 lines or so of Homer's Iliad, he explores all the major questions which we still grapple with as we make war today and consider the questions around warfare. The justification for a major military exercise, the accountability, the quality of military leadership, the nature of courage and cowardice on the battlefield, and indeed what happens to victors and defeated alike in the face of day-to-day brutality.
And yet, in his Iliad, Homer doesn't chronicle the entire 10 years of battle. He focuses on just 4 days of the war's 10th and final year.
He brings us, I think, to the very heart of what human conflict is all about. Some of his most memorable descriptions are of men dying. The 240 deaths that occur in the Iliad, all are different. Homer must have seen action at first hand. He must surely have gone over the battlefield at Troy and tried in his own imagination to recreate how this battle took place. We see warfare from so many different angles, and we see it up close and personal from Homer.
Warriors face off on the battlefield, calling out names and insults. soldiers thrust spears through enemy eyes, swinging swords, hacking off limbs. Homer says black blood stains the battlefield. His name defines this brutal age of warfare, known as the heroic or Homeric era.
This was very much an individual contest for personal glory, and there was believed to be a glory in the nature of your opponents and in the extent of your success over them. It's a bit more tribal. The nature of your military reputation depends upon who you individually fight and how well you do against them.
Homer describes many duels, but one he portrays as the ultimate duel, the one to end 10 years of war. Menelaus, the offended husband of Helen, is challenged by Paris, Helen's Trojan lover. If Paris kills Menelaus, Helen stays in Troy and the Greeks withdraw defeated. If Menelaus kills Paris, he reclaims Helen, takes a king's ransom of gold from Troy, and Greek honor is restored.
The two armies sit down, and the duel takes place. This is sanity, Homer is saying. This is how it should be. But it's not how it goes.
Menelaus and Paris cross swords, risking life and honor to end a decade of conflict. Menelaus overpowers Paris, readies a death blow. Then Homer rescues Paris with a stroke of divine intervention. The goddess of love, Aphrodite, whisks Paris off the battlefield into the arms of Helen. The duel ends unfulfilled. The truce erupts in war.
This war, in a certain sense, had to be. More forces had been unleashed than could now be contained. But at that short, brief moment of time, Homer seems to be saying, this is how conflict should be resolved between the only interested parties.
Though ending a war with a duel between two leaders may be wishful fantasy, many of Homer's observations of battle are timelessly true.
One of the underlying themes that you draw out of the Iliad and the Odyssey that remains relevant today in a military setting is that character matters. That theme remains with us. We still are very concerned for the character of our officers and our soldiers.
Modern armies can learn from the soldiers of the Trojan War. But the greatest of the Greek warriors, Achilles, might not last long in today's army. In front of other warlords, Achilles threatens and insults Agamemnon, his commanding officer.
What a worthless, burnt-out coward I'd be called if I would submit to you and all your orders. Whatever you blurt out, fling them at others. Don't give me commands. Never again, I trust, will Achilles yield to you.
To Homer's audience, Achilles' rage against Agamemnon reflects a conflicted hero defending his honor. But today, his insults would be court-martialed as insubordination.
Achilles was preoccupied with his reputation and his personal standing amongst the Greeks. The absolute opposite of a team player. Odysseus is of course, a different character, and again, he's yet another expression of the fact that character matters. He is wily. He's compared to a fox. Even today, we compare some of our most capable military figures to foxes.
The Swamp Fox, Francis Marion of the American Revolution, and General Franks of the war in Iraq are among some with reputations of cunning like a fox. But Homer highlights another key quality of leadership by demonstrating the opposite.
Never once did you arm with the troops and go to battle. You lacked the courage. King, who devours his people.
Unlike an ideal general like George Washington, who leads his troops by example, Agamemnon is accused of hanging out in the back while others fight and die.
Agamemnon is arrogant, overweening, very much given to advance his own personal agenda, and inclined in the mind of others to take advantage of his position for his personal gain rather than to be a servant of the rest.
Ironically, the soldier who is idealized by Homer is Hector, who fights for Troy. He has the character of the model soldier and citizen.
Hector is more inclined to set the welfare of his people and his city above his own reputation and his own survival. And ultimately, he faced down Achilles even though he knew that the odds were against him and that his time was up.
The battle between the two greatest heroes, Greek Achilles and Trojan Hector, is the climax of the Iliad and Homer's story of Troy. When Hector takes leave of his wife and child on his way to battle, Homer foreshadows the end of the war and tilts the sympathies of his audience in favor of the Trojans.
Hector envisages that Andromache will be a widow and that his son Astyanax will be an orphan. And like any true husband there, he says, I care for you more than I do for my countrymen. It's your fate that really matters to me.
Homer portrays Hector as a family man. While the Greeks are fighting for revenge and greed, Hector is fighting to defend his wife, his child, and his home.
The Trojans, in a sense, are us, and it is through their eyes, very largely, through the eyes of men like Hector, that we read the events that are going to be so shattering.
Hector sees Achilles charging like a stallion. Achilles closes, helmet flashing, throws his spear and misses. Hector hurls his spear, striking Achilles' shield dead center, and glances off. Hector draws his sword and charges, but Achilles has a second spear and drives it clean through Hector's neck. Hector falls to the dust and gasps, pleading with Achilles to return his dead body to Troy. But Achilles promises to feed his body to the dogs, lashes his corpse to his chariot, whips his horses to run around the walls of Troy, and as Homer says, defiles Hector's body in the land of his own fathers. And in the last great scene of Homer's poem, King Priam comes to beg for the mutilated body of Hector, his son.
King Priam comes, and he grasps the man-slaying hands of Achilles, and like a suppliant, he appeals to Achilles' compassion. And Achilles yields, and the two men collapse together in an acknowledgement of their human identity. They're no longer Greek and Trojan. They're no longer deadly enemies. Instead, they are like father and son.
It is here where Homer reveals his subversive mission. He ends what is perhaps the world's greatest war story with an anti-war message.
We are all human. We are all fathers and sons. We all have attachments that go way beyond our national identity. We are human beings, first and foremost.
A truce is declared for the cremation of Hector's body. Funeral laments are sung. The flames from the fire consume his corpse, and looming are the walls of Troy.
Homer does not elect for a Hollywood ending. He elects for an ending which reminds us that more slaughter is to follow. Homer is saying to us, his audience, in a way, you are not to be trusted. More havoc will surely follow. More brutality, more carnage, and ultimately, too, the destruction of Troy.
Although this completes Homer's story, the true story of Troy does not end here. Suddenly, the Greeks are gone, and a wooden horse stands outside the gates of Troy. The greatest Trojan hero, Hector, is dead. Killed in battle by the Greek hero Achilles. After defiling Hector's body, Achilles agrees to surrender Hector's corpse to the Trojans. An uneasy truce is called as Hector is cremated before the walls of Troy. But when dawn breaks and the Trojans brace for another Greek attack, they discover their enemy is gone and a wooden horse stands outside the city gates. This is the true story of Troy. The most famous symbol of Troy, the Trojan horse, comes to us from legends other than Homer's Iliad.
The legend tells us that this was a war that was not won by uncommon acts of valor, by steadfastness and military discipline, all the qualities that we might expect. On the contrary, it was won by a devastating ruse. It was won by deception, deceit, and conspiracy, and all the things that we might consider to be dishonorable in the conduct of warfare.
Everyone knows the story. After 10 years of battle, the Greeks and Trojans fight to a standstill. Then Odysseus comes up with a plan. The Greeks build a giant wooden horse, leave it as an offering to the Trojans, and then sail away. Some Trojans are skeptical. Laocoon warns, beware of Greeks bearing gifts. But myth says he and his sons are silenced by serpents that drag them into the sea. The Trojans desperately want to believe that the horse is a peace offering.
And the Trojans broke their walls down to let the horse enter, stuffed full as it was with Greek soldiers. And in the night, as the Trojans were celebrating the departure of the Greeks, down came the Greeks out of the wooden horse, let in their companions, and proceeded to rape, pillage, and destroy.
By hiding in the belly of the wooden horse and tricking the Trojans into lowering their guard, the Greeks finally penetrate the massive walls of Troy. All of Hector's fears, why he was willing to risk his life to defend his homeland, are about to become true.
Priam was slaughtered at his own altar, Cassandra was raped, and the infant son of Hector was thrown from the walls of Troy, his brains dashed out.
With Hector's mother and father hacked to pieces, his sister sacrificed, his son murdered, and his wife carried off to the bed of a conquering Greek, his family's seed is wiped from the earth forever. For the Greeks, this hard-earned victory means honor restored, the riches of Troy, and Helen. But although there is plenty of archaeological evidence of Troy being destroyed, how could the legend of the Trojan horse be true?
The Trojan horse has become something of a metaphor for trickery, for being able to outwit your opponent, for having something that is so carefully contrived of an artifice that you're given an overwhelming advantage. The idea that the Greeks would have in fact built a large wooden horse, hidden inside it, and had it dragged inside of Troy is certainly possible, but it kind of strains your credulity a little bit that someone really could have pulled that off. My inclination is to see in the Trojan horse some kind of a representation, vaguely remembered, of siege equipment, the weaponry that can be brought up against walls to either bring them down or to somehow neutralize them.
Hittites and Assyrians possessed siege technology. It's possible this Bronze Age weapon of mass destruction could have inspired the legend of the Trojan horse. But whether history or myth, the Trojan horse came to symbolize a war won by trickery and deception.
What the legend seems to be telling us is that even though this war was fought for a just cause of sorts, and even though in the end right won in the sense that the Greeks were victors, nonetheless that victory was at such cost that it put into question the whole validity of the war itself.
Achilles meets his death, struck in his heel by an arrow from the bow of Paris. Odysseus is doomed to wander for another 10 long years before he gets home. Menelaus readies to kill Helen, his unfaithful wife, but when he sees her naked beauty, drops his sword. They too take 10 years to find their way back to Sparta. And as for Agamemnon, on his first night home in Mycenae, Clytemnestra, his queen, having never forgiven her husband for the sacrifice of their daughter, assassinates him in his victory bath.
So the homecoming of the Greeks was, for them, as devastating as was the destruction of Troy.
In fact, history tells us in the wake of the Trojan War, not only do the Mycenaean kingdoms collapse, but the entire Bronze Age comes to an end. There is much speculation as to its cause: civil war, outside invaders, or a string of devastating earthquakes. Greece falls into a dark age for nearly the next 500 years, until the time of Homer. What survives through the Dark Ages is the story of Troy.
If you contextualize this war and you see what comes after that, the decline, the catastrophes, the economic collapse, the Greeks never managed again for the next 400 years to come together as a nation. That was most probably the last glorious event before the disintegration, before the dissolution and the fragmentation of the Mycenaean world. And I think that's why it stayed in the memory.
And as Homer sings stories of Troy, the rage of Achilles, the beauty of Helen, and the valor of Hector, his songs inspire the invention of the Greek alphabet. The Iliad and Odyssey become the foundation of Western literature, and Troy is emblazoned forever into the history of the world.
The Iliad and the Odyssey had enormous impact in the Archaic period, the 7th, 6th, 5th centuries BC. And so, by extension, it's not surprising that people wanted to go to the site where that war was believed to have taken place. Then the residents realized that they need to market the city very aggressively, almost like a Disneyland of antiquity.
The site of Troy rises from ruin to major tourist destination. Ancient burial mounds are turned into monuments to Greek and Trojan heroes. Temples and theaters are built to their gods. And maidens reenact scenes from the fall of Troy.
They would sing sections of the Iliad and the Odyssey in the Agora, in the marketplace of the city, right in front of the old Bronze Age fortification walls.
As the city is rebuilt, history and myth become one, and Troy becomes a war prize in a worldwide conflict.
The Trojan War, among other things, resonates because, from the perspective of many people, in antiquity, down to the present time, it was a conflict between East and West.
In a way, it's the beginning of the combative stances of both sides. It's us against them.
Now, the tourist destination of Troy attracts more than just tourists. First, Persian King Xerxes stops at the site in 480 BC on his way to sack Greece, claiming to avenge his Trojan ancestors. Then, in 334 BC, Alexander the Great stops at Troy to pay homage to Achilles on his way to Persia.
He goes to the Temple of Athena, where he saw a range of armaments associated with the Trojan War. And he looked at the armor that was presented there, chose one set of armor to wear himself in his battle against the Persians. I like to think that it would be that of Achilles, although we don't know that for certain, and then goes off to fight the Persians wearing Trojan War armor.
Alexander the Great conquers Persia, avenging Greece and reclaiming Troy as part of the Western world. Just as Alexander links himself to the Greek hero Achilles, Julius Caesar claims lineage to the Trojan hero Aeneas. And Rome adopts Troy as its mother city. But the Romans embrace more than a mythological connection to Troy. They also model their ideal soldier on that of Trojan hero Hector.
The Romans would say that the ideal soldier was disciplined, was a team player, was willing to sacrifice himself for the welfare of others, was willing to efface his personal glory for the good of the whole.
The military success of the Roman legions is a tribute to the legacy of the Trojans. Even though the Greeks originally defeat the Trojans are avenged when Rome battles Greece.
It's ironic that the Trojan refugees led by Aeneas are purported to have been the ancestors of the Romans, and the Romans in turn conquered the Greeks. And so it's as if history came full circle. The Trojans were conquered and then became the conquerors.
Troy and its stories are the oldest uninterrupted memories of our world. Troy is beauty, language, power, sacrifice, vanity, honor, deceit, and war. From literature to archaeology, history to mythology, Homer to Hollywood. We believe so strongly in Troy that the question of whether it is real or not hardly seems to matter. The search for the true story of Troy will live forever.
There are always going to be surprises.
You don't have to speak the language to be able to interact with people.
Knowing that can make you look at history in a new and exciting